Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this, the fifth in our series of Europaeum online seminars, and the first of this year, 2026. And the title of our seminar this afternoon is US Foreign Policy under Trump 2.0. Is this a rupture or just a transition? And of course, that juxtaposition of rupture and transition comes from Mark Carney's speech recently, in which he indicated that something pretty fundamental was now happening to the international order, the United States' place in that order, and the relationship between the US and its allies. And on what is therefore a very topical subject, we're delighted to have our two guest speakers, Bob Zoellick, former president of the World Bank, and Lora Viola, who is a professor at the Freie University of Berlin, Freie Universität Berlin, which is one of the member universities of the Europaeum. And for those who aren't familiar with the Europaeum, this is an alliance of currently 16 universities across Europe committed to a deeper understanding of Europe, past, present, and future. Bob has very kindly agreed to talk in the context of a book which he produced 5 or 6 years ago, America in the World, A History of US Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. And with his wonderful experience both of domestic politics in the United States and international affairs, as former president of the World Bank from 2007 to 2012, as a US trade representative, as a deputy secretary of state, and as a former White House deputy chief of staff, there's really nobody better placed to understand the interconnection between domestic and international forces in shaping Europe's role in, America's role in the world. He divides the central themes of his book, which is both a chronological account, but also a thematic account, through personalities, but also what he calls five traditions in US foreign policy. And they're all very, very poignant, if you like, in the context of Donald Trump's shift in terms of the style and substance of US foreign policy. The first of those traditions is the emphasis on North America and, by implication, the American hemisphere. The second is the way that the US has traditionally seen foreign policy and its relations with the outside world through trading and technological issues as much as classic foreign policy issues. The third is its ambiguous relationship with alliances to try to ensure, as he puts it in his book, ways to preserve national independence within safe international systems. A fourth is how foreign policy in the United States has struggled with domestic opinion, both public opinion itself and, of course, the power of the US Congress, and how to ensure that leadership is possible within those constraints. And fifthly, and in a way, the most interesting of all, a distinctively American belief in the exceptionalism of America, not just in terms of its power, but in terms of its responsibilities, in terms of it pursuing and defending and advancing a larger or bigger purpose to begin the world over again, to quote, I think, Thomas Paine. So it's a very interesting prism through which to look at the extent to which Trump represents a continuity or a discontinuity in traditional American attitudes to the outside world and the foreign policy and diplomacy that flows from it. So I'm going to ask first Bob to share a little bit of thinking about how things are evolving at this minute under the Trump 2 presidency in the context of that historical perspective. I shall then ask Lora and Viola to react to complement those remarks with her distinctive perspective. And then we'll go into a question and answer session, which will be moderated by my colleague here at the Europaeum, Miles Pattenden. Once again, Bob, thank you so much for joining us live from across the Atlantic. Over to you.
Well, thanks, Anthony, for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to be with Professor Viola as well. We certainly have picked a busy week. And so I thought I would help frame our discussion by making 6 initial points. And then, as you suggest, I'd be pleased to address any questions or comments as we go along. First, keep in mind the centrality of Trump in all discussions. This is Trump's foreign policy, and America has been pulled along. His style is highly personalized. It focuses on power and wealth. He's transactional, so his policy emphasizes deal-making. Appearance is very important. and indeed one can learn a lot from the style of reality TV. He seeks dominance. His mindset is one of zero-sum calculations. You'll hear him talk about winning a lot. Trump likes leader-to-leader contact. Therefore, he much prefers bilateral to multilateral settings. He doesn't have an interest in institutions, and therefore he's not prone to invest in many of the systemic and institutional regimes that the United States helped develop over 80 years. He wants to be seen as a historic figure. This is what you can see with his obsession with Nobel Prizes. Yet, while he's a deal maker, they're not strategic, and often they're not sustainable. He has a short attention span, and the deals often do as well. It gives me no pleasure to say that life at the White House these days is more like a European court of the past. To share a story from one colleague, European security advisor, who came over to the United States not long ago, said that he had to have his meetings with officials by 10 a.m. because they all had to be over at the White House. The decision making is day by day, and you have to be around the court. While he emphasizes tactical moves, sometimes they can put him in a box strategically. And I think that will apply as we discuss Venezuela and Iran. He's discovered in his second term U.S. military power, and we'll see how far that takes him. But also, he's very sensitive to reactions of markets, particularly equity markets. So second, let me look at the path to military action in Iran as offering a good example. So it'd start with the point that it's personal. Trump knew of assassination plots. Indeed, there was a conviction just this week or last week in the Southern District of New York. And this shows up in his observation that I got him first. Depending on the generation, you'll have a sense that America's had a long, frustrating experience with Iran since 1979, and the seizure of the embassy and the hostages. This is visceral, especially for his generation. There were Marines killed in Lebanon with Hezbollah, the bombing of the USS Cole, legacy of plots and killing. And this shows up in Trump's remarks when he'll refer to a 47-year-old conflict. He has been no doubt emboldened by military success with Maduro and the bombing last year of Iran's nuclear facilities. And just to give you my own assessment of that, I think in the case of Venezuela, Marco Rubio and Stephen Miller pushed him to deploy the military in the Caribbean. But there was no deal in the offering. And so he found himself in a box. And General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staffs, actually has specialized in the type of operations that we saw with the snatch of Maduro. And I think this has strengthened Trump's belief that he could use military power. But what I would emphasize here is the distinguish between the undoubted operational expertise of the U.S. military from the strategic. I don't think the Defense Department is a source of much strategic thinking these days, but one cannot underestimate its operational competence. And as part of that, you can see Trump is sort of evolving not from the notion of regime change to perhaps regime alteration, if he could sort of change the leaders and press some policy that is more conducive to his own personal assessment and U.S. interests. In the case of Iran, I think Trump might have been willing to try to do a deal with Iran. He had to surpass what he thought was Obama's failed deal. In the process of his negotiation, he built up the military pressure, but then again, he couldn't back down. Now, I would distinguish Israel's position. Israel does have a strategic view about Iran. It views Iran as an existential threat. It has for a long time. And frankly, its objective is regime change. It appears there was tactical intelligence on the Iranian leadership some question of whether it was Israeli, US, or both. And that forced the need to decide. But Trump has asserted various options about what his objectives are, whether it's the nuclear program, whether it's missiles, whether it's the Navy, whether it's the overseas militias, whether it's regime change. And this is typical for him. This keeps his options open. And as we watch what unravels over the next couple of weeks, he will be very attentive to markets. And the prices of gasoline here are always politically volatile as one approaches the midterm election. So third point, many of you will have at least seen discussion of the administration's national security strategy. So what should one make of that? Well, I think it was an effort by some of the staff to create some cohesion, but vitally important to keep in mind, there's only one decision maker in the system. And that decision maker focuses on deals. If you look at the introduction to the national security strategy, you'll see it's all about deals and his assertions of peacemaking. Personally, I doubt whether he read the rest of the report. Now, the key message that came out of that security strategy was a focus on North America and the Caribbean, and to a degree, the Western Hemisphere. As Anthony mentioned, this is actually one of the historical themes of U.S. foreign policy that I tried to recall in the book that I published. And today, it suits the interests of the American public. But their idea of foreign policy would be narcotics, illegal migration, organized crime, energy, economics. And again, I don't know whether it made the news in Europe, but just this Saturday, even as the war was going on, Trump had a meeting in Miami of Latin American countries for the Shield of the Americas. And the focus was really on the security of narcotics and criminal organizational actions. Now, it's a stretch, but if you go back to the book that I wrote, there is a certain strategic logic of this that you saw certainly in the 19th century and at the start of the 20th century under Teddy Roosevelt. The Roosevelt policy was to dominate North and Central America and the Caribbean. This is when he seized the Panama and created the Panama Canal. But at the same time, Roosevelt's approach in Asia and Europe was balance of power politics. And it may not be generally known, but Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, 1905. That's one of the chapters in my book because it focuses on his skill as a mediator. He also mediated what was called the first Moroccan crisis in 1905, 1906. It was a showdown between France and Imperial Germany at the time. It's one of those peripheral actions like the ones in the Balkans that could have led to World War. Teddy Roosevelt also relied on the U.S. Navy as a projection of power, just as today the U.S. relies heavily on naval and air assets. This was called the Great White Fleet that he sent around the world. This was not a land army. The United States had a very, very modest land army. But of course, we've had a century in between Teddy Roosevelt and today. And over that century, the United States recognized its need for a more active role in the security and economic ties, at a minimum, with what a geopolitical thinker would call the western and eastern parts of Eurasia. So what did the national security strategy say about European policy? Well, he doesn't like the EU. He thinks in terms of sovereign states, so the concept of the European Union is one that he's never been comfortable with. He likes to deal with individual leaders. The European notion of shared sovereignty is a complete conflict with how he views the world. He has, unfortunately, no sense of European history. And he believes that Europe has been a free rider on security, and that's not an uncommon view in the United States after the end of the Cold War. He focuses on trade imbalances and, oddly, only goods, not on services, which is one of his other frustrations with Europe. And being influenced by those around him, he certainly heard complaints of some of the tech industry executives. He has an odd fascination with Putin, who certainly knows how to manipulate him. Trump clearly likes other strong leaders. And to follow up this idea of a deal maker, Trump really wants to settle the Russia-Ukraine war. From my own perspective, I don't think he recognizes that for Putin, this war is about Russian history and his place in it, and he has no intention of settling with an independent, sovereign Ukraine. Now, for all this not so good news, the good news is over the past 70, 80 years, you've created alliance and institutional systems that do have a life of their own. And you definitely see this within the case of the professionalism of the US military and the intelligence services. The promotion pattern for US officers will often require not only joint operations, so with other services, but also combined or alliance roles. So that's built rather deeply into the system. And at least from my perspective, the good news is the United States appears to be continuing to provide intelligence and at least selling weapons to Ukraine. But a word on Greenland, which is the bizarre policy. You'll see part of the connection here is a recognition of its link to the North American security. As my Danish friends know, the first effort of the United States to purchase Greenland was right after our Civil War. Seward, who was Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln, bought Alaska. He wanted to buy Greenland, Iceland, the Virgin Islands, and Hawaii. He also had hoped that British Columbia would become part of the United States. But his view was based on a notion of the magnetic power of the United States economically. It wasn't based on a hostility. I'm afraid this topic is not yet done in Trump's mind. And just to try to give you some sense of what is going on in his thinking, there are people on the security side who would speak to Trump that are focusing on the Russian hypersonic missiles in the far north. If you trace the pattern of those missiles, it would go over Greenland to the United States. And there's a belief that the type of anti-missile defense system the United States would need would be one that people in Greenland would be reluctant to, and the permitting and environmental process would slow down. I have no idea whether that's the case, but that's what they would say to Trump. And a similar idea is that while Russian submarines have been to the east of Greenland, the view would be they might, with the various changes in climate, start to come to the west of Greenland. And they would be more willing to run that risk if it's Danish Greenland property or territory than if it's United States. Now, you can question these. Certainly wouldn't be worth disrupting your NATO alliance from my point of view. But I'm trying to give you a sense of how Trump and some of the people think around him in terms of hemispheric defense. And of course, he ignores the cost to the alliance. What was interesting was when he started to raise this issue, he was pulled back in part by markets. And while the Congress has been pretty weak on most issues, even those in the Republican Party raised objections. There was a congressional delegation that went to Copenhagen. But I wish I could say the issue is over, but I'm not sure that it is for Trump. Fourth point, Trump's trade policy. To use a technical term, it looks like a mess to me. It leaves lots of uncertainty, but keep in mind, Trump likes uncertainty. He believes in, as a deal maker, he can use uncertainty to his advantage. I've warned in pieces I've written for 6 months not to expect a new normal because Trump likes uncertainty. The merry-go-round of tariffs will continue because Trump uses tariffs as a club or as part of a way of deal making or a form of punishment. Now, you will have seen that the US Supreme Court ruled against him in his use of IEPA, the Emergency Economic Powers Act. He's already trying to use other statutes of various types. These have procedural limitations, and there will be legal questions about his use of some of them. But given Trump's behavior, I would expect he'll press forward with them. And unfortunately, from my point of view, the Congress has been relatively passive on its authority over trade and tariffs, which is one of its core constitutional roles. From a political side, but I've perhaps being overly optimistic on this, there is some opportunity for pushback. The polling shows that Americans don't like his tariffs. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs show that the support for trade is in the 70 to 80%, even for jobs. It used to be that it was good for the economy or prices, but even for jobs. And part of the problem in politics is you can't beat something with nothing. And in this case, the Democrats under Biden basically continued much of Trump's trade policy. And so the Democrats are left in a position of saying, well, Trump's tariffs are bad, but our tariffs are good. And that's not really a way to distinguish the issue. What one will see this year is a review of the USMCA. That's the Trump rewrite of NAFTA, the US-Canadian-Mexican trade agreement. It's not a total renegotiation. It's a review process, and we'll see what flows from that. But that will focus on particular trade issues. And in the future, if I were going to guess, where the U.S. might start to move on trade topics would be either ones that focus on minerals, supply chains, maybe technology, some type of sectoral agreements. I would like to see more happen, but I remain cautious on that. The bigger picture, however, is that trade is like water. The United States represents 12 to 13% of trade. It's not going to stop all trade. Trade will flow in new channels, which you already see. And from a European perspective, I know this is probably a challenge legally and even politically, but the discussions between the European Union and the CPTPP, the continuation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if they move forward, could start to shape a future trading system. And then the United States would have to determine, perhaps under some other president, how or whether it's willing to engage. Fifth point, US and China. The two countries together represent 40% of the world economy. They're the two major military powers. They're the two leaders in artificial intelligence. So that relationship is pretty important. Trump has a summit with Xi Jinping later this month. This could be the first of three meetings, more meetings this year, because they will. The Chinese are hosting an APEC summit, the U.S. or the G20 and APEC, and then Xi could have a return visit to the United States. Under my principle of Trump focusing on appearances, he'll want the appearances of success. I was in China last year right after Trump took office, and my determination was that China believes it's figured out how to deal with Trump. It used the critical minerals as a way of pushing back, but it recognizes that he's unpredictable. And given how the administration works or doesn't work, the arrangements made at the top often don't have follow through. I don't see much sign of preparation for this summit. I've taken part in some track 2 dialogues with the Chinese that are trying to come up with ideas. Because Marco Rubio also double hats as the NSC advisor and the NS National Security staff is much smaller, I don't really think there's an effective preparation process through the NSC. Treasury Secretary Bessent has probably the lead on this. He's had, I think, a meeting in Europe with Vice Premier He. And what we've seen is conflicting U.S. positions. So Trump says complimentary things about Xi, but meanwhile, parts of the U.S. government will act on export controls or sanctions. In the past month or two, the White House staff has been trying to exert some control over those. From the Chinese side, they're strongly signaling the sensitivity on Taiwan. And this came through a number of channels that I'm part of. The United States, as you may know, made a very large announcement of very large arms sales to Taiwan recently. And the Chinese made quite clear that there were rumors of additional sales that could have ended the summit. And the action on that first package is somewhat in play. The Chinese will also press on the language that the U.S. uses about the independence of Taiwan. The traditional U.S. position is not to take a position on that and to avoid conflict between the parties. The Chinese would love it if the United States said that we actually opposed independence. And I think one of the bigger questions from a global context is, will the Chinese Communist Party decide time is on its side with Taiwan? They don't like the president, who is associated with the DPP, the Independence Party. On the other hand, the new leader of the KMT, the opposition party, has sounded more pro-mainland. And this is an issue that will also be important as Xi Jinping considers his succession. As you know, successions in Chinese or in communist parties are never easy. This isn't obviously imminent, but Trump or Xi knows from his own personal experience how complex these are, and Taiwan will be an issue in that. My sense is that the Chinese feel quite self-confident, and this actually raises some anxiety within the Indo-Pacific region. If you recall, after the global financial crisis and China felt it was on the upswing, in 2010, that was the launch of the Wolf Warrior diplomacy that was then pulled back. But others in the region are uncertain about Trump's policy on alliances. They've handled it differently than the Europeans have, but the same concern for trust is there. You'll hear a lot of discussion in China about the rise of Japanese militarism. And Japan, not surprisingly, is trying to spend more on defense, given its uncertainty about China and the United States. And this issue of confidence in U.S. security is not only one for Europeans, but one for Asians. So I'll go on a limb here. I think over the next 5 years, you have a reasonable chance that the South Koreans would want to develop their own nuclear weapon capacity. And if they do, there will be intense pressure on Tokyo to do the same. Now, sixth and finally, this may sound disjointed given what we've said, but or what I've said, but I'll prompt you on this. And that is, have we reached peak Trump? That might seem like an odd question to you because Trump dominates the news. We all wait to see kind of what his statements will be, whether they're reliable or not. So he sucks up all the oxygen. But keep in mind, he's in year 6 of 8. He will face restraints at home. I know there were some Europeans that wondered whether the Supreme Court would resist some of his actions. I was one of the signers of an amicus brief to the Supreme Court on the IEPA case. I felt pretty strongly the Supreme Court would rule against Trump, as they have. I believe they will rule against him on issues of birthright citizenship and an issue dealing with Federal Reserve appointments. But there is a legal concept here about the unitary executive, which is that to make sure that all what used to be considered independent bodies like the FTC and others are under the rubric of the executive, and he will win those cases, but he'll lose some major cases. He will likely lose at least the House of Representatives in the midterm elections. We've had a series of primaries and sort of off-term elections, and the Democrats have won all of them. And if the Democrats do take the House, they won't be able to govern, but they will certainly make the administration's life harder. This will not stop Trump, but it will complicate the life of, particularly of his cabinet appointees. My own sense is that the public reacted against his overreach of the ICE agents that you saw in Minneapolis and other areas. What the polls show is that the American public wants control of borders, probably as people do in Europe, but they're not anti-immigrant. In fact, the support for immigration in the Chicago Council poll was, again, around 80%. His political prosecutions are going to trouble people. The rule of law is something that he's sort of pushed to the limit. And of course, much will depend on the economic outlook, and that's partly depends on what goes on in Iran. My own sense is that this year will continue to be one of reasonable economic growth because we have very heavy investments in artificial intelligence and data centers, but there are inflation risks. And if you talk to people who specialize in the economy, they'll often use the analogy to a K-shaped economy. In other words, those people that have assets at the top end are consuming a lot. Those that have low, moderate income, they'll be struggling to get by. The public wants Trump to focus on the economy. If I were to highlight the reason why he was able to beat Biden and Harris, there really were three big issues here. One was inflation. The second was a sense that the border was out of control. And the third was the so-called woke agenda, which was captured by an advertisement that the Trump campaign ran that said, Harris is for they, them, and Trump is for you. And that really is an example of, I think, the overreach that affected the politics here. But that's not where Trump's focus is these days, including on the international agenda. Now, this doesn't mean that Trump will go quietly. In fact, I would suspect that he'll respond to these threats to power with more effort to hold the tension. But again, this is more of a personal sense. I think the public's feeling somewhat worn out by these sort of the constant range of activity. So one issue I wanted to flag for you is it's probably time to start to also look beyond Trump. What's next? My own appeal, but we're all in the world of guesswork here, is that Trump is sui generis. I doubt whether he is transferable, although his hold on the Republican Party base is very strong. I don't think Trump can imagine a successor. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal today about how Trump in various audiences asked people to evaluate J.D. Vance or sort of Marco Rubio. If I were to guess, I think we're going to have a competition that looks a little bit like The Apprentice show over the next couple of years. And then again, on the political side, you can't beat something with nothing. So what will happen on the Democratic alternatives? Right now, the Democrats, frankly, just want to take back the House. There's enough divisions of their own positions. They haven't formed something. But over the course of the next, by late in this year, you'll start to see the debate within the Democratic side between what's kind of considered the progressive left and those that want to take more of a centrist position. So my suggestion for Europeans, and this may seem a little odd, but I'd urge you to consider it, is even though Trump is such a dominant figure, it's important to recognize that the United States is bigger than Trump. So I urge whether friends in European governments or companies to engage in the multiple networks that comprise the United States. So that's also includes state governments, cities, Congress, the traditional partners, as I mentioned, whether it's military, intelligence institution, private sector. Obviously, technology and AI drives a lot of the economy. That's an important part today. And so I think U.S. politics and security are very much in flux, as it appears, at least from this distance, to be the case in Europe. And from some experience going back to actually the second Reagan term and the Bush 41 administration, my sense is that new approaches are often crystallized by responses to events. So we've got Anthony here, as he knows, former Prime Minister Macmillan, when asked about his plans after being reelected, said, "Events, my boy, events." I've never liked the idea that just being maneuvered by events, but events definitely crystallize the politics. For Europe, I suspect that the outcome in Ukraine will shape the future more than any other event, which is why I've been focused on it for the past few years. I certainly recognize the anger overseas, the loss of trust in the United States, and I expect Europe will seek its own greater independent capacity. That certainly makes sense to me, but I also know it's expensive and it takes time to build. And so even after Trump, what I think is important to keep in mind is the U.S. won't vanish off the map. It will remain an economic power, a military power, global reach. And the question really is what will follow and how will Europeans, as they develop their own policy, decide to interact with it. So Anthony, why don't I stop with that? And then we can proceed with Professor Viola.
Thank you so much, Bob, for that fantastic tour d'horizon. A huge number of very interesting questions raised. And somebody who's going to respond to that and also give her own perspective is our next speaker, Professor Laura Ann Viola, who is University Professor in Politics at the John F. Kennedy Institute at the Freie Universität Berlin. She gained her postgraduate degrees, both doctorate and master's degrees, at University of Chicago, and before that, her bachelor degree at Columbia University, which I have the privilege also to be a visiting professor at. Before joining the FUB, she was senior research fellow at the Berlin Social Science Research Center and has held visiting positions at Stanford, Oxford, Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, which is also part of the Europaeum, the University of Antwerp. She's born in New York and is a self-styled adopted Berliner. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Thanks for those remarks, Bob, and thanks for the Europaeum for putting this together and all those joining us online. I think, it's in light of the rapidity of these important events unfolding around us, it's important to have these opportunities to talk about what's going on in the world. I will, I think, echo some points that Bob has already made, but take a little bit of a different perspective or lens, situating, I think, some of the things that we're seeing now in maybe in the context of U.S. foreign policy over time. The event today poses the question of whether Trump's foreign policy is part of a larger transition in U.S. foreign policy or whether it's a full break with U.S. foreign policy traditions. And I think this is a useful question to ask because I think there is some of both going on, and it's useful to disentangle what is part of a longer ongoing structural shift in U.S. foreign policy and what is really a new turn, a rupture with the past. And I think, especially picking up on those last remarks from Bob, it would be really interesting to discuss with everyone what that might mean for how reversible or irreversible these trends might be for the future. So I thought I'd start with some reflection first on the similarities or continuities, if you will, and then talk a bit about the discontinuities or differences or where we might see a rupture. So on the similarities, I'd like to make 2 points. First, just a few months ago, really not very long ago at all, there was this prominent idea out there that what was really new with Trump and his foreign policy, what's distinctive about his foreign policy is his supposed turn or return to isolationism. And every time I have the opportunity to speak on this topic, I emphasize that this idea of isolationism has always been a red herring and a dangerous one at that. On the empirics alone, both in his first term and even before the war, now with the wars, I should say, with Iran and Venezuela, Trump counted among the highly interventionist presidents. And of course, there are prominent Republicans in the US who are against regime change or who want to withdraw support from allies or who don't care about the fate of Ukraine. But this, I think, never really amounted to isolationism. And I think this is borne out in the extent to which the party and even the Trumpist elements of the party are willing to go along with the war in Iran, including much of the base. But I also think that it tells us that America First never really meant that Trump's domestic agenda is not served by an interventionist foreign policy abroad. And in this sense, I would say that Trump is not a break with U.S. foreign policy. The idea of American isolationism is what I would call one of the persistent myths of U.S. foreign policy. On this, the scholarship is very clear. The U.S. has never in its history been truly isolationist. Even in the period from 1776 to 1945, the United States has been characterized by military and economic global interventions. And one reason for that is because the U.S.'s incredible structural power position in the world, both economically and militarily, has been, and I think it still is, incompatible with this kind of isolationism. That means it has the interests and also the means to act, and that often proves irresistible, especially when those two factors come together with the kind of president who has those personal characteristics that Bob so nicely laid out in his first point. The second point that I'd like to make is that, in my view, U.S. foreign policy since the early 2000s, let's say 2003, has been wrestling implicitly or explicitly with the U.S.'s relative decline as a hegemonic power. And I see Trump as part of this trend. Now, by any measure, the U.S. is, as I already said, incredibly powerful and still more powerful than any other country today. We see this in simply the comparison of what Russia has tried to do and what the U.S. has been able to do, for example, with the so-called extraction of Maduro in Venezuela or in Iran, either now or last summer. But the U.S.'s influence over other countries and other world events has been decreasing relative to its high point 2 decades ago. And importantly, its special status of being able to set the terms of international cooperation along its own preferences has more or less ended. And I mean, I'd be interested in hearing also Bob's perspective on this with, a comparison over several decades. The U.S. has less leverage in international organizations. It has less leverage in confrontations with adversaries. It has markedly lost leverage over allies. That means by no means does it have no leverage, but it has lost a kind of leverage that it used to have only a few decades ago. To give you a few examples, already with the Obama administration, the U.S. was unable to bend trade negotiations to its will within the WTO. The U.S. was not able, which had been a different story in the up until the 2000s. The U.S. was not able to deter Russia from annexing Crimea in 2014 or from the full-scale invasion in 2022. Biden was unable to restrain Israel, despite exerting significant private and public pressure. The relationship is a very different one now with Trump, of course. But these are just some examples. And I think there are several reasons for this relative decline. Part of the story is that other countries with preferences that are divergent from those of the United States have been rising in power and influence. And as the world has gotten more interdependent, especially economic leverage has been diversifying, so that there are a larger number of countries out there now that we might call systemically significant, that their actions can affect many other countries in the system, and including the United States. And this shift in influence has made it more difficult for the U.S. to reach consensus on its preferred outcomes. It's increased the costs to the United States of using its resources to overcome disagreement and impose its will on others who may have other preferences. And it's also eroded domestic support for a reinvestment in U.S. leadership. So the question I think that the last several U.S. administrations have faced is how should the U.S. respond to an international order in which it plays a less dominating role, or at least a role that's less easily or that's more costly to play a dominating role in. Will and should the U.S. remain a supporter and an underwriter of this order in an era in which it has fewer privileges, in which maintaining its preferences through multilateralism and diplomacy is more costly and also less popular domestically? These are a set of questions that are not new. They've been faced by the last several administrations, and all of those administrations, I would argue, Obama, Trump 1.0, Biden, and now Trump 2.0, have responded, albeit very, very differently in detail, but in one similar way, and that is by reducing and recalibrating U.S. leadership on international cooperation, by engaging much more selectively on issues, by being generally less supportive of multilateralism, by moving more towards many-lateral solutions, by being more protectionist. We can recall Obama's pivot to Asia, his leading from behind policy, his deferral again on the annexation of Crimea to the Europeans, his insistence on raising NATO defense spending and recalibrating burden sharing, an issue that Trump, of course, has picked up on, but really goes back earlier. Obama's frustration with the WTO. Similarly, Biden, despite his America is back claim, did not significantly reinvest in multilateralism, but rather in minilateralism. He had a foreign policy for the middle class idea that was much more protectionist on trade, less keen on globalization than in the past, and also continued sort of the undermining and dismantling of the WTO that Trump had engaged in. And I would argue that Trump's America First slogan and his tapping into fears that America is no longer great, right? America needs to be made great again, are not really incongruent with these broader shifts. They all reflect ways of coming to terms with the relative loss of American power and privilege. Now, having said all of that, let me turn to why, as I think we're feeling, Trump's foreign policy is nevertheless a radical shift, or as Carney called it, a rupture. First, just to say that I think the shift I see happening is not that the US was once somehow fully committed to liberal internationalism and now it's not. Rather, I think the shift is from what has always been a highly ambivalent relationship of the United States towards the rules and procedures of the so-called liberal international order, but to now an outright rejection and aversion to that. The US has historically both written and upheld international rules and norms, and also broken those and exempted itself from them. So, that alone is not a big distinction for Trump. Also, withdrawing from international organizations is something that we've seen in the past in many administrations, but we could look especially to the 1980s and the Reagan administration, where we've also seen this kind of withdrawal in a turn to unilateralism. I also don't think it's accurate to say that the US under Trump is suddenly somehow imperialist, or that what is different about Trump is his imperial ambitions. Some people have made this argument because the US has had imperialist tendencies from its beginning, and those have taken on different forms in different periods and different regions of the world. So that also, I think we could see that in Venezuela, for example. This is not a particularly unique characteristic to Trump. So US foreign policy has always been characterized by this tension between what you might call, on the one hand, sort of liberal ideals and illiberal practices, on the other hand. But up until recently, the political narrative of the United States foreign policy establishment has been clearly embedded in what we can call a liberal script. And by that, I mean that whatever the effects of actual policies and practices, there has been a commitment, at least a rhetorical commitment, a framing commitment, that the US aims to create an order based on free trade, on liberal markets, on democratic values, and some form of rule-based cooperation. And even hawkish neocons embraced a version of this, a belief in the importance of spreading democracy, for example, of liberal markets, of, on the one hand, spurning international organizations, but still using them and going to them and following the steps of holding them up. This narrative, I think, has now been abandoned in the Trump administration. Trump is committed to American power primacy. His foreign policy, I think, is based on an even inordinate belief in American power, but it's now based on, as Bob has already said, a personalized presidential politics rather than institutionalized rules. It's not rooted in an idea of collective good, and it does not see the strategic and normative value of restraints on power. This is reflected, for example, in Stephen Miller's statement that after the Venezuela intervention, that the real world, in his view, is governed by strength, by force, by power. So in my view, the major change with Trump's foreign policy is its drive to be fully unhampered, unencumbered by constraints, whether these be the need to take into account the interests of others, to heed institutional constraints at the domestic or international levels, or to pay at least rhetorical service to legal constraints at the domestic or international levels. What we saw very clearly in the case of Venezuela, and now again with the war in Iran, for example, is that neither Trump nor his administration are at all invested in providing consistent and convincing justifications for military action, either to a domestic or to an international audience. Many commentators have noted this, and they've chided the administration for being inconsistent, for giving different rationales. And they've interpreted this, as far as I can tell, mostly as an inconsistency that is a sign of incompetence and lack of strategic purpose or vision. But I actually think this inconsistency reflects something more, I'd call it more sinister. I think Trump doesn't care about justifications at all. He doesn't care that they're inconsistent, because providing a public justification is a kind of constraint. Informing Congress is a kind of constraint. Working with allies or through institutions are constraints on the exercise of power. And I think this is a key characteristic that distinguishes his actions from previous interventions, is that he does not want to be bound by these constraints. And those changing justifications is a demonstration of exactly this carelessness for constraints. And I think this brings me to the second thing that I think is really a rupture here, and that really makes Trump a break from other U.S. presidents, and that is that Trump is intentionally and strategically building a presidency around executive power unconstrained by the legislative and judicial branches and unhampered by a professional bureaucracy. And I think this is the biggest implications for U.S. domestic politics, but it also has significant implications for foreign policy. And I'm not sure that this is only a matter of Trump's personality. I think we can have a discussion about whether this is simply sui generis. I think that there is from my view, more of a strategic and methodical approach to the strengthening of executive power at the expense of other kinds of constraints. The U.S. foreign policy and national security apparatus, the State Department, but also the expertise in the Department of Defense are hollowed out. And this is what Dan Dresner has called the shallow state that we're dealing with now. The accountability mechanisms, professionalism, and expertise in foreign policy are not functioning. And this is certainly the result of certain personnel decisions, right, who has been tapped to be in the cabinet of Trump. But again, I don't think this is simply only his personal preference, but part of a broader attempt to concentrate power in the executive and to weaken these other branches. A weak state apparatus, along with greater executive power in turn, increases the importance of the personal politics of the president. And so it's not only the result of his personalized approach to politics, but it actually enhances the personalized politics of the president. And I think we've seen this very clearly in the way that personal fealty is important to Trump. Again, Bob has mentioned this, in the way that he's tried to personalize and politicize particular institutions, the military. I think here is very much a break with politics of the past, this personalization and politicization of the military. And again, to the way he thinks of foreign policy as a matter of personal deal-making. What political science scholarship has shown, though, is that institutionally unconstrained personalist leaders tend to be more militarily aggressive rather than less so. They're more amenable to shows of force and use of power to enhance their own standing. So I think, on the one hand, the personalized politics aligns with Trump's own personality, his own predilections, but they fit into, I think, a broader political attempt to concentrate power in the executive. And I also think that in doing so, they create structural changes that are important beyond Trump himself, and that also have a structuring effect on how policymaking works and how it's done. And in particular, a permissive effect for the kind of foreign policy that you're seeing now, more aggressive, more based on the use of force and power. So where does this leave us on the future of U.S. foreign policy? I'm going to make three brief points by way of conclusion. And I think these sort of create a nice, I don't think they contradict really anything that Bob said, but maybe opens up a nice space for discussion then. So first, I think the spectacular way the complex military intervention against Maduro happened with apparent ease and with little to no opposition from other actors clearly emboldened Trump. We saw this immediately with respect to Greenland, now with Iran, and also increasingly with Cuba. Trump's threats to other countries need to be taken seriously. This is the lesson that Europeans are learning because he's currently unconstrained to intervene and also to destabilize countries. But at the same time, he does have little interest or a sense of responsibility in taking seriously the consequences that follow. And what this means, I think, is for the near term for sure, but also because these are complex problems, for the at least medium term as well, more instability in the world. I think that, I mean, we can discuss this as well, but if we look at what's happening in Iran, it's unlikely that we're going to get more stability out of the current operation. Second, while Obama and Biden, as I've argued here, also had to wrestle with a relative decline in US power, I think Trump's actions to make America great again, as a response to this decline in power, has the potential to actually hasten this decline. It's a classic dilemma. He's bringing about the state that he hopes to avoid. And I think that, again, that this is an effect that probably will outlast Trump, because it is not only a matter of his personality, but it has shaped also the institutions around him. Third, and relatedly, I think that Trump's breaking off constraints on the US presidency's concentration of power in the executive, his personalization of policymaking, both domestically and internationally, will reshape the presidency for a long time to come. And I think that will be true also for presidents who might be inclined to reverse or adjust or moderate his politics. So one thing that Trump supporters celebrate, what they feel, I think Trump offers them, is, in their words, that he's effective. This is a word that you hear Trump supporters say again and again. He's an effective president. And even people who are not necessarily Trump supporters say he's the most effective president of my lifetime. He gets things done. And of course, he can do that because he doesn't, he's taken off the constraints around him, right? And I think whoever follows Trump will risk appearing inactive, passive, slow, reactive, simply by following rules and norms and submitting to institutional constraints of a democratic process. And this risk is likely to pose a particular problem for more moderate and more democratic leaders. In other words, not only has Trump, I think, issued in a radical change in sort of the basis of how U.S. foreign policy is done and justified, but this change is likely to be self-reinforcing over time, even if the U.S. elects a more moderate president, because the incentive structure around the office has changed, because the absence of those constraints is very difficult to put constraints on power back on once they've been taken off. We've seen this in the past as well. For example, when Congress, through legislation, reduces constraints on the president to engage in military aggression abroad, even presidents like Obama, who would like to reverse those liberties, never quite get around to doing so. So maybe a less optimistic outlook from my side, but I hope to be persuaded otherwise and look forward to the discussion.
Well, Laura, thank you so much. Very, very stimulating set of remarks. And one big idea, if you like, underpinning them, the notion of the projection of America's power supremacy, I think, as you say, unhampered by constraints and potentially reshaping the foreign policy presidency for coming decades. I'm now going to ask my colleague, Dr. Miles Pattenden, who is a distinguished historian of papal politics, and that's real politics, the conclaves of electing popes, and who directs our ideas program here at the Europaeum, to come in and moderate a Q&A session. We've got about half an hour in effect. We've got some questions already lined up, and we've got about 75 people currently online. I think we peaked almost at 100. It's a very stimulating discussion, and over to you, Miles, to draw out the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you again to both our speakers, to Robert and to Laura, for some very interesting and stimulating points made there. Please, could I encourage all of you, if you'd like to ask questions, to type them into the Q&A box, and I will read them out in an appropriate order. If you'd like to leave your question anonymous, then please do so Otherwise, I may call out part of your name at least. So we'll start perhaps with a question from Hal, which is, if you were advising a future democratic administration, then how to approach foreign aid and trade, how do you suggest they rebuild or reimagine institutions and ties after the Trump era is over? So perhaps, Bob, you could respond to that first.
Well, on the optimistic side, as I said, I think on issues like immigration and trade, there will be possibilities for the right type of leadership to reframe the issues. The public, as I had mentioned on the case of immigration, the public wants the border under control, but they're not anti-immigration. But nevertheless, we've got a very polarized system, and it would not be easy process. But I think this is again where coming back to Lora's point about executive leadership, a Democratic president could play that role. On trade, I wish they would be a little bit more willing to move on some of the trade issues. I would start by some of the areas I mentioned, whether sectoral, supply chain, but also agreements with individual countries tend to be more supported here because you can draw the linkages. But I want to come back really to a point that Lora mentioned, because it came up in an interview I did with Rahm Emanuel, who's the former mayor of Chicago, would like to be a candidate for president, will be a candidate, about her point about executive power, which is that I think she's definitely right. One of the stunning things about living in the United States these days is that every day Trump seems to press executive power to the limit beyond what I could ever conceive of. And I don't think that'll go away. So I asked the question, Lora, to Rahm, saying if a Democratic president is there, what will be the effect of on executive power? And like you, he said it's hard to turn these things back. As you properly pointed out, this is not new. Frankly, Obama and Biden also stretched this. Having said that, and I like the way you put your comments in a historical context, you can never be sure about these things. Nixon was the imperial president until he wasn't. And this is the point about events sort of leading to some pushback. The broader point on the Democratic side is that, frankly, you're going to have a battle here between kind of the progressive left, where the energy of the party is, but is likely not to get elected in the center, and people that come across as more sort of left centrist. And on the left centrist side, you've seen there's various governors whose names sort of get mentioned. And part of this, again, always will come back to, you tell me how people perceive Trump's performance 2 years from now, and I'll give you a better sense because it'll be a vote for change. If you permit me, Mouse, I want to come back, however, to another point that Lora mentioned that I think is very important, and that is this notion of U.S. decline. I understand it in sort of the political science sense, and certainly compared to the situation, say, in the late 90s, you can make that case. However, remember, Nixon and Kissinger were talking about multipolarity in the 70s, right? And people will often use the term multipolarity. And what I caution is, I think it's a more complex system. So if I look, for example, at military power now, it's the US and China. It's a binary system. Now, the question will be, will Europe develop its capacity, and then whether Russia sort of at a second tier? If I look at artificial intelligence, it's a duopoly. It's the United States and China, again, and others, well, they're going to play along. If I look at the dollar is going to remain the reserve currency. It'll get, there'll be, because of the questions, it'll get sort of challenges at the edge and margin, but it's always a question of compared to what. On the other hand, if you look at production, that is certainly multipolar. If you look at trade, as I mentioned, that's multipolar. So I think it's going to be a more complex system. And I think the key point that Lora emphasized, and this will be an issue, it really is a way of addressing the question on the Democratic side as well, is that you'll see many discussions in the United States now about, well, is it multilateral or is it and global or is it nation state? And some of the people who are associated with Trump's first term draw this distinction. I think it's a straw man. If you look at the US, and kind of Laura's made this point, is that historically, the challenge for US leaders was how do you use alliances and institutions and regimes to extend your influence? So it wasn't a question of either or. It's a question of how you serve as a catalyst, a negotiator, a compromiser. And again, I always like to bring practical experience in this. I was the lead negotiator for German unification for the US. There's a classic case where, frankly, everybody in Europe, other than Lora and the Germans, were against the idea, and the U.S. sort of weighed in and played a role in that process. Lora mentioned the WTO. Lora, go back to 2001, because of the rise of the membership and the consensus principle, I started to focus on the need to have bilateral, regional, and global agreements. So it was a complex. If you look at climate change, most of the scholars that I know look at this, look at a regime complex. It's not going to be sort of just a one sort of global system and being able to deal with this sort of issue going forward. If I look at Ukraine today, this, again, one of the things where I was frustrated on the European side is I've been pressing under international law to be able to transfer the frozen Russian assets for 3 or 4 years, which is a rather obvious step. And so what I'm trying to explain here is where Trump has been a break from the past, and I totally agree with Laura on this. He doesn't want the constraints of systems or alliances or institutions or explanations. I don't think that's going to last forever, but it'll be the question of how people restitch it together. And the real challenge for American leadership, frankly, is how do you extend your power by working with others?
Thank you very much, Bob. Lora, would you like to add some words on this subject?
Yeah, I'll maybe pick up this word regime complex. I think that's absolutely right. So we have to bring some more nuance into this. And I think it's right to look by issue area things and also by region, things look very different, right? So European relations have always had a different dynamic than, for example, US relations with Latin America or with Asia. And production is definitely a different story than the military or technology. As much as the Europeans would like to think otherwise, right? This is we can't lump all these things together. But I do think this trend towards regime complexes is something that that is taking on a new form and a new shape, and it means that the United States does not have the same kind of leverage within these systems that it once was able to have. And this is frustrating, of course, for the United States, especially if it has to face this question about how to use alliances and institutions to extend its own power. And with respect to the participants' question on the WTO, I think this is a place where we can see this. So I think that the United States has moved out of the WTO exactly because it hasn't been able to use it to serve its interests as well as it thought it could, or as well as it was able to do in the past. And here we see from the aspirations to have a World Trade Organization that brings all countries together to negotiate multilateral agreements. We see a system where you have many more bilateral agreements, many more minilateral agreements, and this has made the trade system more complex than the WTO itself, I think, weakened. Now, what I think that has been in the United States' interest, right? It's been pushing this. I think that if we wanted to sort of strengthen the WTO or ask the question of who has an interest in strengthening the WTO, it's not necessarily the United States. I think it is the middle powers, if you will, and also many countries from the global south who initially were seen as in the anti-globalization movements of the 1990s as the sort of losers of globalization, the World Trade Organization. But now the World Trade Organization is the place where they can still maintain a seat at the table. And they're the ones who are trying to hold on to it I think, more than the United States is. So, I recently had a meeting with Secretary General of ASEAN, and he made the case that they want to keep the WTO strong, right? They want the multilateral process because for those countries where it will be difficult to maneuver these regime complexes, where influence and leverage means, is everything, and the rules are less protective. Right? They have an interest in returning to the kind of format like the WTO. But I don't think I think that's not going to be necessarily in the interest of a future U.S. administration in that way. And also because they have the ability to maneuver outside of these multilateral organizations that have tended to be a safeguard for those countries that have less leverage. So I'm not so sure we'll see incentives to bolster these institutions coming from the United States, but from other countries instead.
Thank you very much, Laura. Now, we've had a couple of questions which are essentially about President Trump's perception of the EU and Europe. So I'll read them together. There's one from Carl, which asks whether the shift towards protectionist measures under President Trump is a temporary disruption or a structural change in US trade policy towards Europe. And one from Christian, who asks to what extent Trump's skepticism towards the EU is driven by the perception that it is a trade competitor rather than an ally. Does his preference for dealing with individual nations aim to undermine the EU's collective bargaining power? So perhaps, Laura, would you like to go first this time?
Sure. So, I do think that Trump views the EU as a trade competitor, and he said that many, many times. The question of protectionism is a little bit tricky, right? The EU engages in its own protectionist policies, and the United States, long ago, there were negotiations between the United States and Europe to come to a free trade agreement between the EU as a bloc and the United States. And one of the reasons this agreement fell apart was because the Europeans did not see enough protections for things like the environment and labor, and the United States saw these as attempts to have non-tariff barriers in place, to have protectionist measures in place. And I think that the United States has had its own tendencies to promote certain kinds of protectionism. So I do think that Trump has said, and I think he does believe, that the Europeans are gaining trade advantages through protectionist measures, and that he's responding essentially in kind. On the one hand, by forcing or through a punitive tariffs that are trying to sort of level out those differences, and also because I think he has said for a very long time that tariffs are one of his policy measures of choice to achieving all sorts of different aims. So on the one hand, the trade competition with Europe, I think, is something he really perceives as important for the US economy. But I also think that he sees tariffs per se as a valuable policy tool in a way that previous presidents have not. He thinks he can achieve not only changes to the trade deficit, but also that he could raise revenue, for example, for the federal government, that he can use to reduce taxes on Americans, that he could use it as a bargaining chip to get other kinds of concessions and then reverse the trade tariffs. So I think both things are going on. On the one hand, is a trade story, and the other hand, there's also there's a story of a longer history of protectionist measures on both sides. But there's also the story of trade of terrorists in particular being a tool that Trump sees for achieving many different and also conflictual policy goals.
Thank you very much, Laura. Bob, would you like to say a few words on this subject?
Just briefly. Trump's attitudes on trade have been clear since the 80s, when he was ranting against the U.S. trade deficit with Japan. So the fundamental problem with his analysis is that remember I said he sees the world through winning and losing. He sees the trade deficit as losing. And for anybody that understands economics, they understand that that in fact it's a series of macroeconomic conditions. The United States actually had a trade surplus in the 30s when we also had 25% unemployment. If the United States grows faster than others, we're going to have a trade deficit. But in particular, he then focuses on bilaterals, which is even more troublesome. So I've tried to explain to various audiences, I have a bilateral trade deficit with my supermarket because I buy things there, but I don't stock the shelves at night to get an offsetting surplus. I get money somewhere else. So the US has a surplus with Australia. Australia has a surplus with China. China has a surplus with the United States. But having said this, this is where Laura's structural points are important to keep in mind here. The advent of China into the international trading system is going to have shock effects for quite some time. From a US historical perspective, it actually was a challenge to first bring Japan into the international trading system after World War II and an integrated European customs union, as the question sort of suggested. And China has proven kind of a stretch too far. I don't believe that you can just leave it that way, because both sides are the US and China represent about 40% of the world economy. But this is where you start to get some of the destabilizing elements of some of the Chinese policy. And then to bring this back to Laura's point on kind of on the WTO, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is the Director General, was a colleague of mine at the World Bank. After she moved to Geneva, said to me, "Gee, Bob, have the Indians always been so disruptive?" And if you talk to generations of trade negotiators, you'll find that the Indians were always frustrating the WTO. So exactly as Lora said, where I think one of the unfortunate turns of history were, frankly, when I was negotiating this, or Pascal Lamy for the European Union, we were trying to promote systemic benefits at the same time we were trying to do national benefits. And because you had a lot more members, and frankly, some of the rising developing countries like India and Brazil saw it as more in their interest to stop the negotiations, the US would turn elsewhere. And I sort of forecast that by at least offering the alternatives of FTA, free trade agreements, which grew into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But so I think one of the challenges is, as you've got structural shifts in terms of number of countries compared to, say, the Uruguay round that played an important role, would the United States feel it was worth the pain and effort to try to maintain the overall global system? As for then the particular question about whether seeing the European Union gives it more cohesion, that is definitely one of Trump's concerns. You can see that he wants to go smack at the Spaniards or something else along the way, whatever his frustrations are. So I think this is symptomatic of the flux in the system that we've been describing.
Thank you very much. Now, I think we're going to take another couple of questions together as time is slowly running out. And these are slightly less connected, but perhaps you can both still speak to them. The first is from Ulrich, who asks, what is your view on President Macron's recent speech on nuclear weapons, the forward deterrence? How does that play into this? And the second is from Franca, which is about President Trump's Africa policy. Does it fall within continuities or breaks in the history of US foreign policy? And how does it affect the broader scheme of transatlantic relations? So, Bob, would you like to go first again?
Well, on Ulrich's question, I understand Macron's desire going back more broadly for strategic autonomy that he stated a couple years ago. The problem is, as Ulrich knows, because I know his own background, is that this stuff is expensive. And so are you going to pay for the military? Are you going to pay for the intelligence systems? The reason why Europe is, I'm sure to the frustration of some Europeans, tried to play along with Trump is they've got Russia on the Ukraine border and on the eastern border. And Europe doesn't have the capability to deal with that on its own. So that comes back to the power reality that I keep trying to remind that will still exist post-Trump. As for the nuclear offering, Ulrich, I think it's probably a positive mood, but French diplomacy, I wouldn't rely on it if I were in a fix. And so again, I think it's worthwhile, seeing what comes out of sort of Trump's behavior, that we try to restore some of the security stability, including on nuclear issues, that help keep the peace and avoid nuclear proliferation. On Africa, look, Africa has never been at the center of U.S. foreign policy. On the trade side, we had something called AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is a preference act. Trump obviously has no interest in it. Today, and other focus on Africa has primarily been of a humanitarian nature or trying to mediate conflicts. I was dealing this with Sudan and Darfur at various points. Today, where Trump is interested in the developing world is a question of minerals, sometimes supply chains, or sometimes immigration and narcotics and organized crime. It's instability. And I think one of the points that sort of Lora made, but I kind of wanted to sort of emphasize here, it's fundamentally a negative agenda. It's not trying to construct things. It's trying to use the power of the United States to achieve sort of short-term ends. So in terms of larger African policy, I think this will also be an issue front and center for Europe, because as I look at the demographics and immigration issues, I think if sub-Saharan Africa is unable to be stable and unable to be developed, that's going to have a big effect on Europe.
Thanks, Bob. And Lora, would you like to say a few things about this?
Yeah, I mean, on the nuclear issue, my colleagues Alexandra Debs and Nuno Monteiro wrote a really nice piece several years ago already on the strategic logic of nuclear proliferation. And their puzzle was, why haven't we actually seen more nuclear proliferation given the security threats experienced by many countries? And I think, the argument that they make helps us understand why we might be seeing more nuclear proliferation in the future. On the one hand, if you have a strong ally that has a reliable and credible nuclear umbrella, then even if you face a security threat, you might be less willing to go ahead and invest your resources in creating your own nuclear capabilities. When that ally becomes unreliable, looser in their terms, then you have greater incentives, especially when you face a security threat, to try to proliferate. And we have a Europe in which they're getting the message that the United States is not reliable, and they have certainly experienced a security threat in their near environment. And so they have sort of the willingness and to go ahead and explore nuclear proliferation or expansion. But those things will be conditioned on their capacity, their ability to actually do it. And that is a very strong condition, because it's a constraint on the Europeans, as Bob has said. And it also will be conditioned by their relative power, their ability to actually engage in greater proliferation or greater investments in nuclear weapons without becoming targets for other countries that are threatened by that. So I do think what we see in France fits into this logic quite well, but we have to see how strong those constraints bite, as it were, the capacity, the technical capacity, the industrial base is essentially absent in Europe for the kind of defense development that it would need, and also the question of how much power Europe would be able to muster, and how threatening that might be to others, and who would want to dissuade any further investments.
Thank you very much, Lora. We're reaching the end of our time here, but perhaps I'll be permitted to ask you both just one further round of questions. And first of all, apologies to those of you who have submitted questions in the question and answer and we haven't got to them. But I'm going to go to a couple of anonymous questions, and you may perhaps see why they're anonymous. But hopefully you won't have to answer them at too great a length now, because we only have 3 minutes left. But the first one is asks simply, Trump is a deal maker. What's his deal with Russia? And the second one is even shorter. It's just 2 words. It says Jeffrey Epstein. But I suppose what it means by that is, are there serious questions about how the release of files will impact not only Trump's domestic status, but also his relations with European countries like Norway, France, or the United Kingdom? So I'll leave it up to you how to strike the balance between those two lines of inquiry. But perhaps, Laura, you'd like to go first again this time.
All right, I'll do my best. So, what's the deal with Russia? I think this probably falls into Bob's first 2 points. On the one hand, Trump fashions himself a deal maker and thought he could make a deal, and he hasn't been able to do so because Putin is not interested in a deal. I think that's the short answer on that, and I think that. Trump was willing to go quite a long way in making that deal, but again, it's not a deal that Russia or Putin feels that they need to make at this point. On the Epstein files, so the question doesn't say very much, right? We can ask very many different questions about the Epstein files. One question I've heard is whether the Iran war is a distraction from the Epstein files. I don't believe that. I don't believe that for a minute. I don't think that that's what motivated the Iran war. Another question is why the Epstein files seem to have more legal consequences in Europe than the United States. On that, I think, the jury's still out. We'll have to see what happens in the United States. Whether the Epstein files can be sort of the thing that brings Trump down, right? That leads to his downfall. I don't believe that either. I don't think, I think we would have seen that already. I think it's a thorn in his side for sure, but I don't think that we will see the Jeffrey Epstein files having that effect on Trump. It's of course, something that he doesn't like to have in the media all the time, but I think that's still a far cry from having real consequences for him and his administration. The last thing I would say is that there's a very interesting piece by a professor of law at Columbia University, New York Times, that asked the question of, whether the Epstein file release is a good thing or not, and what it says about our institutions. And I think one interesting point to think about is whether the way the Epstein files have been released is another sign or signal of how the institutions are not working well. So in a properly working sort of institutional system in the United States, these files would have been properly viewed through the Department of Justice and not in the public domain, so that they could be adjudicated not in the court of public opinion, but through proper processes. And I would fear that this is becoming more difficult to do. But the attempt of making them public was to try to gain some transparency, to create public pressure to have that justice brought to bear. So unfortunately, I think the files show on a number of levels how our institutions are not working very well at the current moment.
Thanks, Laura. And Bob, the last word over to you.
Okay, I'll be very brief. I first met Putin in 1992 when he was a deputy mayor in St. Petersburg, and I met him on a number of other occasions over the years. And he is what you would expect. He's a cold-blooded KGB agent, and he knows how to manipulate people. And I personally think he's manipulating Trump. Second, I think Trump respects power. You see this in his attitude towards Xi Jinping and his attitude towards Putin and others. Third, because Trump has no sense of history, but he really wants to go down in history as a peacemaker, it might seem odd. He's drawn to this idea of deal making. I know it. I say these things and it sort of bounces off, but you can't understand his behavior unless you understand the deal making mindset. And by the way, a zero-sum deal-making mindset. And in this case, if you step back and you could say, what's the likelihood Ukraine's going to recover all those territories? Well, not very, very high. Okay. So is there a potential deal of territory for peace? In theory, you could come up with that. The problem is, because he doesn't understand the nature of Putin and Russian history, I don't think he appreciates that Putin does not want that deal. Putin wants to dominate. He doesn't want to have an independent, sovereign Ukraine in any way, shape, or form. And I think Putin, by the way, has manipulated some of the issues about NATO enlargement to kind of make to appeal to his case. And so I worry that actually Trump in his search for deals will put more pressure on Zelensky. And this is where I hope actually that some combination of others in the United States and frankly in Europe kind of help resist that. And maybe the benefit that Zelensky has now provided, Ukraine has provided with anti-drone weaponry will show that frankly, the Ukrainians at great personal sacrifice have, in my view, helped with the security of Europe and the United States. As for Epstein, I'll just build on a point that Laura made. This will not topple Trump. I mean, if you think of all the things associated with Trump's behavior, it just washes right off. I think the deeper problem here is that for a public that's kind of grown weary and skeptical and sometimes angry about some of the economic conditions and sort of worried about whether effects of AI or their kids living in their basement at home, it just shows a rottenness at sort of the top level of American society, academia, business, politics, and it just stinks. And so I worry that its main effect is just, again, further undermined confidence in the institutions and civic society that democracies depend on.
Thank you very much, Bob. Perhaps I can now hand back over to Anthony, who's going to say some final remarks.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Miles. And an even bigger thank you to both of our guest speakers, to Bob in Washington, D.C., to Lora in Berlin, for your really fabulous and extremely thought-provoking talks. We really appreciate that. And also your great answers to the questions that were posed from the and by the digital floor. We'll be continuing a discussion inside the Europaeum about some of these questions next month, but in person when we have the European Spring School here in Oxford, the theme of which this year is Europe and Trump 2, Transatlantic Futures. 35 students will be joining us from across the network. But finally, last but not least, thank you to all of you online, the online audience, for joining us for this most recent European online seminar, and have a most agreeable evening. Thank you so much. Goodbye.